Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Today we'll be talking all things threshold. By the end of this video, you'll understand the basics of threshold, like the science behind it, and how to implement it via feel, because not everyone has a lactate meter. And finally, you'll learn how to progress it in a safe manner that's focusing on longevity rather than making huge improvements in a short amount of time and burning out. You'll probably even learn some more complex concepts like long tempos versus threshold intervals, and this is all going to help with the training and becoming a better runner. I'm a running coach for 20 athletes. I also run myself. I do everything from 5Ks all the way up to ultra marathons. And I'm fairly well known for doing minimal speed work and getting to where I've gotten. But that being said, I've learned a lot more about speed recently, and I see that there's more of a time and place for it. And I'll be incorporating it a bit more into my training moving forward. But this video is all about threshold. Before we get into the nitty-gritty details about threshold, we need to understand the scientific basics of what's happening in our body. Everyone knows the term lactic acid, and we think of it as the thing that causes fatigue in our legs and makes it feel jelly. But in reality, lactic acid is just a product of glycolysis, which is the glycolytic or lactate system, the energy system. Lactic acid is actually lactate and hydrogen ions, and the hydrogen ions part of lactic acid is what causes the jelly feelings in the leg. But the reason why we measure lactate, blood lactate, is because that gives us a good indicator of how much hydrogen ions there potentially is in the muscle. Because when you consider the fact that lactic acid is lactate and hydrogen ions, we can assume that an increase in blood lactate would mean an increase in hydrogen ions, and that is why we go for blood lactate when we're talking about threshold. Professional runners measure their blood lactate by pricking their finger and getting their blood lactate levels, and that's easier than seeing what's happening inside the muscle. Now, lactic acid is actually a byproduct of the glycolytic energy system. The main product that we get from this system is ATP, which is our energy unit. Like, think of it as 1 ATP equals 1 energy unit. There are 3 energy systems in the body, and the ATP PCR system is the immediate energy system. It produces energy that's enough to withstand for like 5 to 15 seconds. It's your really explosive stuff. Tennis swings, really powerful movements, like 100-meter sprints, that sort of thing. And this can be performed with just the stored ATP in our muscles. We don't need to produce it because we're not doing it for that long. Moving on, we got the anaerobic energy system. I refer to it as the glycolytic or lactate system as well. There's a lot of names for this one. But all you need to know is that this is the one that produces lactic acid as a byproduct, and it does produce ATP as well. And thirdly, we're talking about our long-term system, our oxidative or aerobic system. And this will produce energy very slowly, so we get ATP at a very slow rate, but we can do it for a very long time. The most important thing you need to know is that all 3 energy systems work together in unison, but they're contributing at different ratios depending on the intensity of the run. Obviously, if you're doing a very long easy jog, there's very little contribution from the anaerobic energy system because there's no requirement to produce a lot of energy fast. So we're relying heavily on the oxidative system. One key thing to remember though is that the aerobic system still dominates in tempo and threshold runs. But since the pace is just below lactate threshold, the anaerobic system starts to contribute more than it would in easy or moderate runs. The last thing you need to know from this section of the video is that lactate is measured in millimoles per liter in blood. Moving on to more threshold talk, when we're running at an easy intensity, we're actually always producing lactic acid, but we're more or less clearing it out as quick as we're producing it, so we don't see that huge spike in lactate. However, it is important to note that there are very slight increases in lactate levels as we run for longer. So the general trend is that the longer you run, the more of a rise there is in blood lactate levels, whether you're running quick or slow. Except the rate at which that happens will obviously increase when we're running quickly. But there's a significant point in the graph where your lactate levels suddenly become a bit more exponential, meaning they rise or shoot up quite rapidly. And that's what we call our lactate threshold or anaerobic threshold or LT2. Those are the most common names, but it is also referred to other stuff like MLSS, and yeah, there's a ton of different names. Now, you may have heard the term LT1, LT2 quite a lot, and we're going to quickly unpack what that means. It's not to do with pace, it's actually to do with blood lactate levels. The most important thing you need to know for this entire video is threshold is not actually about literal pace, it's about how much blood lactate there is in your body. So we need to disassociate pace from threshold for a second and really understand what's going on in our body to then therefore translate these into pace ranges and a better understanding of how to do the workout. So LT1 is simply when blood lactate levels rise a bit above resting levels. So it is going to be just above your easy run pace. It's not like necessarily easy run pace exactly. For example's sake, we're just going to say it's just above your easy run pace. So you're still able to have a relative conversation, but you might need a break or two in between when you're running. But you might have to separate a couple words in the middle of a sentence just to get a bit of a breath in. And that's how I would describe what LT1 kind of feels like. Now, LT1 is a pace that we can still hold for a very long time. We can hold it for 2 or 3 hours, which is quite a long time. LT2, on the other hand, is what everyone understands as like that lactate threshold, what you can hold for 45 to 60 minutes. You hear about it all the time. But this is referring to the final point before blood lactate actually just shoots up and skyrockets, like goes exponential. That turning point from going like linearly to suddenly exponential is LT2, or lactate threshold, or anaerobic threshold. Now, depending on your ability, you're going to be able to hold it for longer or shorter. And even if you compare two people with the same PBs, you might notice that they hit LT2 at a different point. And we'll talk more about the implications of that later on in the video. So obviously an elite runner and an average runner could have the same LT2 blood lactate levels, like the point at which blood lactate starts to rise exponentially. However, the velocity, like how fast you're running at that point, is obviously going to be a huge difference between an elite runner and the average runner. So what we care about more is velocity at threshold, at that turning point. That's actually a really good indicator as to how good someone will be at racing. 9 times out of 10, when we take out strategy and like running economy for longer races, usually when we're talking about races from like 5k all the way up to maybe, yeah, like a marathon, let's just say, and disregarding the factors that I just mentioned, velocity at threshold is a really good indicator at who's going to win that race. Whoever's running the quickest at threshold is basically going to feel the freshest in the final kilometer, and then can probably sprint at the end and kind of win the race, or even like pull away slowly later in the race when people start to go lactic and get tired and get heavy. So this is why threshold is actually very important. Now, one other thing I will mention is when we're looking at that turning point, or LT2, or anaerobic threshold, we're looking for like a 2 millimole or more increase. And the reason for this is because if we're measuring blood lactate with a lactate meter, there's like a margin of error of like 1 millimole. So if you don't see an increase by at least 2 millimoles, we don't actually know if that's a genuine kind of increase. So that's why we like to look for that really clear sign that there's a huge spike in the lactate. So what are we trying to achieve with threshold? We're basically trying to achieve two things. One is that we want to increase our tolerance to run with higher blood lactate levels. So that's going to allow the turning point of the graph to be a little higher. Like we can withstand a lot of blood lactate before it suddenly shoots up. So increasing the height, or increasing how much lactate is in the blood before it suddenly shoots up. We're also trying to shift the curve to the right, and that's referring to running for longer before our lactate spikes. So those are the two things we're trying to improve. Let's quickly address threshold for beginners. If you're pretty new to running, you may have noticed that it's pretty hard to run for like more than a minute at a time if you're like super new and you just started. Yeah, this is kind of referring to the fact that you're running everything at threshold at the start. Even if you do start to get a little bit of experience, it's really easy for you to push the blood lactate a bit too much, and then you're running at threshold quite often. But I don't think this is something you have to worry about, because when you're new to running, you're not running that many kilometers at the start anyway. So it's kind of safe to be doing a lot of your mileage at threshold, because there's no way around it anyway. If you want to run slower than threshold as a beginner, you probably have to walk inevitably. But at the start, I think it's better to just enjoy the sport, do whatever you can without getting injured. So focus on the strength training, but just do whatever runs you want. If you want to sprint up a hill, do that. You can run fast at the start and run slower at the end. All this doesn't matter. Let's try and get the volume up so that we can build the capacity to do all these threshold sessions. But at the start, technically you are doing threshold all the time. So we talked about how LT1 is a pace that we can hold for about 2 to 3 hours. LT2 is what we can hold for about 45 to 60 minutes. Again, there are some exceptions. Some people are super fit. They can probably run for longer than 60 minutes at LT2. But one of the most important things to understand from this video is that this isn't our threshold pace that we should fixate on and think of it as the be-all end-all. First of all, threshold is going to improve over time. It's not going to improve immediately. You're not going to notice differences from week to week, but over the course of like 2 months of solid threshold training, it's going to improve. The other thing is that threshold pace is relevant to the rep that you're doing. So, like I said, LT1 and LT2 are referring to blood lactate, not pace. So what we're saying for LT1 is that if we find our pace that we can hold for 2 to 3 hours, your blood lactate levels are going to be at LT1 by the end of the 2 to 3 hours. But when we're doing a threshold workout, we're not running for 2 to 3 hours. So we're not going to hit LT1 if we're running at 2 to 3 hour PB pace, right? Like if you're doing an 8x1k at LT1, we're nowhere near 2 to 3 hours. If we're running that slow, there's very little point. Obviously, if you're early on in the season, maybe that's a good starting point, right? Like to get used to what threshold workouts are like. But as we move throughout the season, we don't want to be working at our 2 to 3 hour PB pace for an 8x1k workout. So this is where threshold intervals become kind of relevant in this video. We're trying trying to make our blood lactate levels match LT1, which is our 2 to 3 hour PB pace, in a shorter amount of time. And the way we do that is actually to run quicker, but not too quick. It's easy to go too quick in a threshold workout, so you need to stay disciplined, but we also don't want to go too slow. I hope this makes sense because this is the main thing that people are getting wrong. People are too fixated on the pace. So what we're aiming for is that like 2 to 3 hour feeling, but we're trying to replicate that sort of feeling and extrapolate it to the rep duration. So if we're doing 1K reps, we're going to be running a fair amount quicker than actual 2 to 3 hour pace. Exactly the same thing with LT2. We can hold that for 45 to 60 minutes, yes, and we're finally going to reach LT2 in terms of blood lactate levels if we run 45 to 60 minutes all out, or like at an even pace as far as we can. But if we're running that pace for 400 meter reps in an LT2 workout, we're obviously not going to be working at as high of an intensity as we want, and we might not even reach the blood lactate levels that we want, because 400 meters is too short for the blood lactate levels to rise enough to actually be of any significance, which is why we have to adjust threshold to the rep duration. It takes a bit of time to get used to, what sort of feeling we want to be at when we're doing all these workouts at LT1, LT2, but I think you'll learn from each workout. And it's better to stay on the conservative side at the start. Also, I did say earlier that blood lactate will increase over time as you run further. So this actually means that if you do it in a really smart way, like again, we're going to use 8x1K as an example, you could actually start at LT1 and end at LT2 by running the same pace. Because you can run fairly quick but feel really fresh in the first rep of an 8x1K workout, but by the end it might feel a little bit harder but still not all out, and therefore that might be an LT1 progressing to LT2 workout, and that's actually quite a good workout. It's nice to mix it up sometimes, but you could have some workouts that are purely LT1 based and purely LT2 based. It's actually good to just cycle through and mix everything up. That's kind of the goal. But before I talk any further about how to implement it to your training, let's quickly understand the differences between two of the key threshold workouts. There is one that's slightly better. I made a whole video on this about Jakob Ingebrigtsen's blow up in the half marathon at Copenhagen, and this is really relevant to continuous tempos versus threshold intervals. Continuous tempos are also known as traditional tempo, 30-minute tempo, long tempo, lots of stuff like that. And I actually used to do a lot of this, but there's actually more benefit to doing threshold intervals than continuous tempos. But the one benefit of continuous tempos is you get very aerobically fit. I have a huge base. I've done 50 kilometers at 3:49 pace. I do like 30 kilometers at 3:45 like tempo. Yeah, I've done like half marathons at 74 minutes, which is like around 3:31, 3:33 per K. I've done 2 of those as a long tempo as well. And yeah, I feel aerobically fit because of that, but I think I missed out on a lot of the gains that can be made through threshold intervals, which is why recently I started doing more threshold intervals. Now I'm going to mention for the third time, blood lactate increases as you run for longer. What we know is that when we're doing a long tempo with no rest in between, we know that our blood lactate is going to slowly increase over time. We have that risk of actually making it go too far that we suddenly spike the lactate later on in the run, right? And because we want to be sensible and not let the blood lactate spike suddenly, we're actually going to be running pretty slow at the start of a continuous tempo if we're running like a 30-minute tempo, for example. And that means it takes a while to be at that zone that you want to be in terms of threshold, which is why threshold intervals is really good, because technically we're trying to spike the lactate a little bit quicker to get to the intensity that we want, like LT1, LT2, in between that sort of thing. We want to get to that quicker and then kind of stay in that for as long as possible. So we do short reps in threshold intervals, and we try and increase the lactate levels to right below where we're going to spike the lactate, and then we take a rest and it'll go down a little bit, but not too much. So we kind of allow ourselves to spend way more time and kilometers spent at threshold, because we might be able to do more reps and it might end up being more than a total of 30 minutes. And even if we do less, we might spend more time at threshold because of the fact that we're increasing our blood lactate levels quicker in the run. Quick little niche hack for anyone doing long tempos. Maehara talks about how doing 2x400 at threshold before the 30-minute tempo that he does kind of helps bring the lactate levels up a little bit before he starts the 30-minute tempo. So that could be a good way to make sure that you get the most out of your long tempos as well.
Yeah, so a bit of a modern warm-up is, do a bit of threshold in the warm-up. Because I'm doing a 5-mile threshold run today, I'll do a 2x400 at threshold off 30 seconds recovery, just kind of rolling the pins out. I guess in comparison to normal strides, just prepares the body a lot better. Yeah, it gets all the systems firing. It actually spikes the lactate a little bit, which is what we kind of want. Strides don't really spike lactate. It's only a 15-second, stride or whatever. So by doing a bit more of a continuous kind of, threshold rep, spike the lactate a little bit, so then when we start the workout, we're not shocking the system.
The other benefit of threshold intervals is that we can run way quicker than a 30-minute tempo. We don't have to be as sensible. We can run fairly quick and still be within threshold when we're doing 400 meter reps. A bit less so when we're doing 1k reps, but it's still better than doing 30-minute tempos. But on the other hand, if we do threshold intervals only and completely start neglecting long tempos, we lose our ability to pace well. We lose our ability to run at threshold for a longer amount of time. So when we're doing longer races, if you're typically a 5k runner, you're going to struggle a bit more in the 10k races, half marathon races, marathon races. So as we move on further in distance, we want to get used to being able to run at threshold for a longer amount of time. So there's a time and place for it, but majority of the gains should come from threshold intervals. So we're talking about, once every 3 to 4 weeks, depending on context. But threshold intervals is something that we can do every single week, maybe even twice a week. Some people, professional runners, go up to like 4 times a week, double threshold days 2 times a week. But you should always talk with a coach and decide what's most applicable to your training history and running journey. This is the part that you're all waiting for. We're talking about how to implement it to training. How do we do these threshold intervals? How do we progress it over time in a safe manner and think about sustainability? There's a lot to threshold intervals. I can make a whole video on just this topic and dive into deeper detail, but let's simplify it so that it's easy for you to understand. So one sample threshold interval is 16 by 400 with 60-second rest in between. You can jog it, you can stand, and there's obviously different benefits to standing recovery, jog recovery. But what we can do to progress threshold intervals is the rep duration or distance. So whether we're running 400 meters, 600 meters, 1k, 1200, or some people do duration like 1 minute reps, 2 minute reps, 6 minute reps and whatnot. We can play around with the rest, how long or short our recovery is. We can play around with the number of reps. We can play around with the total volume at threshold, which is also kind of how many reps / distance. So there's a lot of parameters we can play around with to progress our training. We don't actually need to progress every single week. Obviously we need those recovery weeks where we kind of absorb the training. So technically you could cycle through it and not even think about progression and just like try really different sorts of workouts here and there. 16 by 400, 4 by 6 minutes, 8 by 1k is the 3 examples I've used so far, but there's plenty of others. Keep in mind I've made the workouts pretty basic so far, but we can go as complex as you want. So you can do 12 minutes at LT1 followed by a 2-minute jog, into 8 by 2 minutes at LT2 with a 60-second jog followed by a 2-minute jog after that set, and then you can do 2 by 6 minutes at LT1 with a 90-second jog in between those. And the 12 minutes at LT1 would be slower than the 6-minute reps at the end at LT1, because we all know now that the longer the rep, the slower you have to go if you want to stick to the proper threshold pace. People do like 3 by 7 minutes, even up to like 3 by 10 minutes for some people, depending on what you're training for, right? There's a lot of stuff that we can look at. I'll use my situation currently as a great example. So last week I did 9 by 600 with a 150 meter jog. Straight after that last rep, I did a 300 meter jog straight into 8 minutes at threshold as well. So in total, my volume at threshold for that workout was about 7.6 Ks. Now I was happy with how I did the workout. I feel like I stuck to threshold. I didn't push it too much. I felt pretty good, and I felt like I had plenty of reps in me, which is good. That's exactly what you want in threshold. But how am I going to progress that 9 by 600 followed by 8-minute workout to next week? So I did 7.6 Ks at threshold. So for this next workout, I want to do 8 Ks at threshold. I want a bit of progression. I want to spend more time at threshold. And I also want to make it a little bit harder by increasing the rep duration or distance in this case. I did 600 meter reps last time, but I want to progress that to 1k reps. So I'm going to do 8 by 1k, where I'm going to run slightly more distance at threshold. I'm going to do longer reps, so it'll be a bit harder. But we don't want to make every single parameter that I talked about earlier harder. So I'm actually going to give myself a bit more rest. Because the duration is a bit longer, I want to give myself a little bit more rest than last week. So the rest duration might be a little bit more. So we're making some parameters harder, some parameters a little easier, but overall we're seeing more time spent at threshold, which is what I'm trying to go for right now, because the beauty of threshold is in volume. The more time and distance that we can spend at threshold, the better it is in the long run when we're trying to progress and becoming a better runner. But again, do it with caution. Don't progress every single week. I'd like to add that it's not always about increasing your volume as well, because the shorter reps will allow you to run a little bit quicker naturally. Having some weeks where you do like a shorter workout can be helpful as well. The elite runners that do double threshold days, they do like longer reps in the morning and then shorter reps in the afternoon, so that they get stimulus from both ends of the spectrum in terms of threshold. You gotta think of threshold as a pain-free way to get fit. It feels good to finish a workout and actually not feel like you're hammered and dead for a few days and whatnot. You kind of feel good and you still ran fairly quickly. So take pride in that and trust that it will help you when you combine a ton of threshold workouts together week on week, because you're not going to see the benefits from one threshold workout. We're going to see the benefits when we string together 8 solid weeks of threshold workouts week in, week out. Even if it's one threshold workout a week, it'll make a huge difference in the long run. We don't need to think about pace too much when we're progressing our threshold, and the reason for that is because you're naturally going to feel better and therefore run quicker as we progress over like a 2-month period. Let's also not forget there's a lot of factors that affect your ability to threshold every single day. So your your threshold pace isn't going to be the same from day to day, but this is why we look at linear trends and not how you're feeling on one given day. You could feel really crap on one day, but feel really good on another day, so you should always adjust your threshold paces to the day, which is another reason why you shouldn't fixate on pace. I'd rather focus on volume, how much time we're spending at threshold. Are we decreasing our rest over time? Like, you might do a 16 by 400 workout on 1 week with 60-second rest, but progress it to a 45-second rest in like 4 to 5 weeks time. Because even if you're not necessarily running quicker, you're decreasing the amount of rest and you're technically making it a little bit harder, but you're still running the same pace, and you can see kind of progression in that way as well. So these are all the small things I'm thinking about when I'm training athletes. Again, I coach 20 athletes, and when I'm trying to progress their threshold over time, I always try and get the athlete to stop fixating on the pace and just trust in the volume. And also obviously just trust in my training, because I know that I'm overlooking the training. I can see what they've done the past few weeks and what we're going towards. I want to progress in a safe manner. You may be wondering, Sota, how have you not talked about heart rate yet for threshold? Now, one of the reasons for this is because a 400 meter rep or even a 1 kilometer rep, it takes a while for your heart rate to rise and then plateau for it to actually mean anything. So unless you're doing like a 30-minute tempo, I would not bother with heart rate, and I'll be more focused on feel. A lot of people really think I'm insane that I barely ever look at heart rate. To be honest, I never really look at it, and even if I do, I don't care about it. And the reason for this is because I understand feel so well that heart rate doesn't matter anymore for me. But I don't want to open a can of worms. We'll save heart rate talk for another video. Another important thing though is do not go too quick in threshold. You would rather go slightly slower than quicker, because it's really pointless when we obviously spike the lactate. We want to stay on the cautious side at the start, and as we get used to what threshold feels like, maybe we can start like riding that fine line a bit more. But at the start, just staying between LT1 and LT2 is perfect. We don't need to actually know whether we're running exactly LT1 or exactly LT2. Just somewhere in between is going to help you benefit, and just changing up the reps will kind of give you a different stimulus anyway. Obviously we can't see because we're not measuring lactate, but it's really important to start running by feel and get used to what stuff feels like. You might remember one of the goals that I mentioned earlier about being able to tolerate higher blood lactate levels regarding shifting the graph upwards. So once you get good at being sensible and running at threshold a lot, sometimes you can go a tiny bit above threshold and build that tolerance to be able to run for longer even with a higher blood lactate. And that doesn't mean spike it purposely and run way too quick, but it just means going a little bit above LT2. But I would do this way less often than the LT1 and LT2 workouts, because the main benefit that you'll get is doing more volume and being able to run for longer without spiking the lactate. In terms of rest between reps in a threshold workout, you can jog it or just stand around, but I like running the whole time. I don't really like pausing and stuff in the middle of workouts, so most of the time I'm jogging between the reps, and that also makes sure that I have to stay a bit more sensible during the reps, because jogging will kind of keep the lactate levels, at a fairly elevated level compared to a standing recovery. It keeps me honest, it keeps me sensible. And if you're not sensible, I think it's better to start with standing recovery and then progress to jog recoveries. However, even as a person that is sensible with threshold, I think it's still important to have standing recovery sometimes for the shorter workouts, because it allows us to run a bit quicker in the actual reps while still staying at threshold. A great example of this is the 16 by 400 video that I made in the past, where I only had 45 seconds standing recovery, but because I was running the 400 meter reps fairly quickly, I was doing 3:15 per kilometer, which at the time, because I was unfit, was like my 5k pace even, but PB wise it's more like my 10k pace. But because I was running fairly quickly, I wanted to make sure that the blood lactate levels kind of go down a little bit so that I can spike it a bit more in the next rep and actually get these like quality 3:15 per kilometer reps in. Because if I'm running a 30-minute tempo, I'd never be running 3:15 for 30 minutes. That's definitely not my level. To wrap up this section of the video, I think it's important to remember that there's a time and place for all types of runs. Your speed work, your easy runs, because threshold is that middle point between, like VO2 max, LT1, and easy pace, right? And then there's your topping speed here as well. So we go topping speed, VO2 max, LT2, LT1, easy pace. While we're on this topic, let's quickly talk about the limiting factor in our training. So everyone's good at different stuff, right? Like if you come from a fast track background, your VO2 max might be super quick. If you're coming from a marathon, your base is going to be huge, right? It's important to know where your threshold sits in relation to VO2 max as well. So VO2 max is the maximum amount of oxygen we can use at a given time at a high intensity, and this is usually a pace they can hold for about 7 to 8 minutes. But if our threshold is so good that it's getting really close to our VO2 max, we probably will benefit more from increasing our VO2 max so that there's more room for improvement for threshold. Your threshold will never be quicker than your VO2 max, so we need to raise that roof and build that potential. But for some people, their VO2 max might be so high and the threshold might be quite low, and we can work on that threshold to try and get close closer to that. So it's always context dependent, and you should talk with the coach on what you should be working on. But as a general rule of thumb, it's pretty good to work on everything, but it's still good to know what the limiting factor is at a given time in your training cycle. That's going to be it for the video, guys. Hope this is super helpful. Leave a like and comment below if you have any other questions. And also, if you do know a fair amount about threshold, feel free to reply to other people, because it's really hard for me to always reply to every single comment, but I want to start discussions in the comments. Do you do enough threshold training? Are you doing a lot of continuous tempos when not enough threshold intervals? Like, let's all try and help each other become better runners. And what I love about my YouTube channel is that I always get super long comments, and it shows that people spend time to write these comments, and I really appreciate it, and I actually really love the community I'm in. And if this video is of any value, it'll be hugely appreciated if you can donate a coffee in the description. You can do anything starting from $5. And my most recent 3 donors are Alexandria, Cliff, and someone with a username called Human. But thank you so much for the 3 coffees. Really appreciate it. More videos coming soon. Let me know if you want me to talk about any other topic in the comments. And I will see you in the next video.